A fox tried to steal a farmer's chickens, but what he did instead shocked everyone watching. The red fox's teeth closed around the chicken's neck and froze. Through the pre-dawn darkness of the Welsh countryside, the rooster in her jaws went rigid, waiting for death's familiar twist. But the fox's mouth remained still, jaws trembling with restraint rather than killing intent. Her amber eyes were fixed not on prey, but on something beyond the chicken coop's wire fence. 3 tiny fox kits, no more than 2 weeks old, abandoned in a hollow log at the forest edge, their mother's body lying still beneath a farmer's trap 50 yards distant. The chicken's heartbeat pounded against the fox's tongue. The kit's desperate mewling carried on the morning wind. And in that impossible moment of hesitation, the vixen faced a choice that would rewrite everything she knew about survival, territory, and the thin line between predator and parent. Wait before the next revelation happens. If this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. The fox released the rooster. The bird stumbled backward, wings flaring in confused panic, squawking the alarm call that should have come minutes earlier when predator scent first invaded the coop. But fear had locked its voice, and now, released from jaws that should have killed, it could only express the profound disorientation of prey granted impossible mercy. The vixen stepped back from the coop, her small body, perhaps 9 pounds in her late pregnancy weight, shaking with the effort of restraint. Every instinct screamed at her to take this food, to drag it back to wherever she could find shelter, to feed the gnawing hunger that came with nursing kits who were not hers, who should not be her responsibility, who had become her burden through the cruelest mathematics of survival. The rooster fled to the far corner of the coop, joining the hens who had pressed themselves against the wooden walls, their primitive brains processing the miracle they had just witnessed, but finding no framework to understand it. Chickens knew foxes killed. It was encoded in generations of barnyard terror, in the stories told through genetic memory of raids that left feathers and blood and empty nests. But this fox had not killed. She had held and released, and in that release was a violation of natural order so profound it seemed to suspend the morning itself. Thomas Pritchard, who had farmed these 70 acres of Welsh hillside for 43 years, watched from his bedroom window with binoculars he normally used for checking distant sheep. His hand was on the shotgun he kept by the door, the same weapon that had killed the kit's mother 2 nights prior when she'd raided his coop and taken 3 hens. But his finger did not move to the trigger. He had watched the fox approach the coop with the determination of the desperate. He had seen her work at the wire with teeth and claws, finding the weak point where the fence met the wooden frame, the spot he had meant to repair but had postponed, the gap that was her entrance and his negligence. He had watched her slip inside, silent as shadow, death incarnate in russet fur. And then he had watched her stop, watched her hold the rooster, watched her entire body communicate a struggle that transcended simple predator-prey dynamics. He did not know about the kits. Could not know that this vixen had found 3 orphans 12 hours prior, had tried to ignore them, had attempted to return to her own den 3 miles distant where her own litter waited and had been unable to do it. Could not know that she had spent the night moving between 2 impossible needs, her own kits who needed their mother, and these orphans who needed anyone. Could not know that she had tried to nurse both litters and found her milk insufficient, her body unable to sustain 8 young on the sparse prey she could catch while maintaining double territories. Could not know that she had come to his coop not out of malice but desperation, seeking food that would let her produce milk that would keep 8 kits alive instead of watching 5 of them die while she saved 3. All Thomas could see was a fox who had invaded his henhouse and then, for reasons he could not fathom, chosen not to kill. He lowered the shotgun. It was a choice made in the same heartbeat the fox had made hers. Instinctive, defying logic, flowing from something deeper than the simple mathematics of property and predation. The vixen backed away from the coop, her eyes sweeping the farmyard for threats. She saw the farmhouse, saw the shadow in the window that was the farmer watching, saw the possibility of death that came with every human encounter. But she also saw the chicken feed scattered in the yard, saw the barn door slightly ajar, saw a territory rich with food that could save her if she could access it without triggering human violence. She retreated to the forest edge, to the hollow log where 3 kits, 2 females and a male, their eyes barely open, their coats still fuzzy with newborn fur, squirmed and mewled in the darkness. She entered the log and let them nurse, feeling the inadequacy of her milk, knowing it was not enough, understanding with the clarity that came from having already lost 1 litter to starvation that she was racing against time. The kit's mother had been a young vixen, perhaps 2 years old, on her first successful breeding season. She had chosen her den site poorly, too close to human habitation, too near the chickens that were her easiest prey. She had made 3 successful raids on Thomas's coop before the 4th raid ended in the trap's steel jaws closing on her leg. In the long hours of terror before the farmer found her at dawn, in the shotgun blast that was mercy and murder combined. She had died knowing her kits would die too. It was simple reality for solitary animals whose young required weeks of intensive care. Without their mother, kit foxes became food for other predators, or they starved, or they froze when temperatures dropped. Nature did not provide backup plans for orphans. Except, somehow, impossibly, this other vixen had found them, had smelled milk and desperation, had investigated and discovered 3 tiny lives who should have been invisible to any fox but their mother, and had made a choice that defied evolutionary logic. She had tried to save them. The visiting vixen's own kits were 3 weeks old, robust and healthy, denned in a secure location beneath a rock outcropping 3 miles south. She should have ignored these orphans, should have let natural selection take its course, should have returned to her own litter and ensured their survival rather than splitting resources between 8 kits when she could barely sustain 5. But she had lost her first litter the previous year to a late snow that had killed the prey base and left her unable to produce milk. She had watched 3 kits weaken and die over the course of 2 terrible weeks. She remembered, if foxes could be said to remember in the narrative sense humans understood, the helplessness of watching life fade from bodies she was supposed to protect. When she had found these orphans, their mewling had triggered something deeper than instinct, stronger than self-preservation. She could not save her first litter, but perhaps she could save these. Over the following 3 days, the vixen established a desperate routine. She would hunt at dawn and dusk, taking mice and voles and the occasional rabbit, consuming what she caught to produce milk. She would travel to her own den, nurse her kits, then travel 3 miles north to nurse the orphans. She slept perhaps 2 hours in every 24, her body consuming its own reserves, her weight dropping as she tried to sustain 8 lives on resources meant for 5. It was not sustainable. She knew this the way animals knew things, through the exhaustion in her bones, the weakness in her legs, the way her ribs began to show through her fur. She was starving herself to feed 8 kits, and the mathematics of that sacrifice pointed toward collapse. On the fourth day, she returned to Thomas Pritchard's farm. Not to the coop this time, but to the barn where she had seen the door ajar. Inside was chicken feed, grain stores, the detritus of farming that attracted mice and rats. If she could hunt in the barn, she could catch multiple prey in a single location rather than ranging miles for scattered voles. She slipped inside through the gap in the door, her nose reading the space. Old hay and oil, chicken mash and diesel, and underneath it all, the rich musk of rats who had made their homes in the stored grain. She caught 2 rats in 30 minutes, their city cousin wariness no match for fox reflexes. She consumed them both, feeling the protein begin to restore what nursing had depleted. She was preparing to leave when she heard it. Footsteps, heavy boots on concrete, the farmer. Thomas entered the barn carrying feed sacks, his morning routine bringing him into what had become the fox's hunting ground. He saw her immediately, a small red shape frozen in the shadows, her eyes reflecting his lamplight, her body tensed for flight. They stared at each other across perhaps 20 feet of barn floor. The farmer, in his mid-60s, his hands worn by decades of work, his mind shaped by the pragmatic realities of agriculture. The fox, young and desperate, her body language communicating exhaustion and determination in equal measure. Thomas should have shouted, should have driven her away, should have sealed the barn and eliminated this predator who had already cost him 3 chickens and would likely cost him more. But he was thinking of the moment in the henhouse, of the fox holding the rooster and releasing it, of a choice made that he still could not explain. "You're a puzzle, aren't you?" he said quietly, his Welsh accent softening the words. The fox's ears swiveled toward his voice, reading tone more than content. Not aggressive, not threatening, simply observing. Thomas set down the feed sacks. Slowly, telegraphing his movements, he backed toward the barn door. "I don't know what you're about," he continued, speaking more to himself than the fox, "but you had my rooster in your jaws and let him go. That buys you something. Don't know what, but something." He stepped outside and pulled the door not quite closed, leaving the same gap the fox had entered through, creating what was either an invitation or an acknowledgement that she would return anyway. Over the following week, an unspoken agreement formed. The fox hunted in Thomas's barn, taking the rats that would otherwise consume grain, removing the mice that would spread disease to livestock. She avoided the chickens completely, as if understanding that they were the boundary she could not cross without breaking whatever truce had formed. Thomas, for his part, began leaving the barn door precisely positioned, open enough for fox entry, too narrow for his sheep to wander in. He did not leave food out. That felt too much like domestication, like crossing a line that should remain uncrossed. But he hunted less aggressively in his fields, left brush piles where rabbits might shelter, created conditions where a nursing vixen might more easily find prey. He did not know about the 2 litters, did not understand that his tacit permission for barn hunting was making the difference between 8 kits surviving and half of them dying. He simply knew that a fox had shown mercy to his roosters, and that this strange mercy seemed to deserve reciprocation. The vixen's routine became more sustainable. Hunt the barn at dawn and dusk, travel to her own den, nurse her kits, travel to the orphans, nurse them. Sleep in brief intervals, always alert, always aware that this arrangement could collapse if the farmer's tolerance wavered or if other threats emerged. Her own kits were thriving. At 4 weeks old, they were beginning to emerge from the den, to play, fight, and explore, to show the personalities that would shape them as they grew. The orphans were weaker, smaller, born to a mother who had been young and likely undernourished herself. But they were alive, growing, their eyes open now, their coats beginning to show the red that would mark them as adults. Then came the night everything changed again. Thomas' granddaughter, Megan, arrived for a summer visit. She was 8 years old, raised in Cardiff, with the city child's romantic notions about farm life and wild animals. Her grandfather had warned her about the fox, had explained, in terms suitable for a child, that they had an understanding with a wild animal and she must not interfere. But Megan was 8, and 8-year-olds processed warnings through the filter of curiosity and the conviction of immortality. When she saw the fox entering the barn at dawn, she followed. She watched from the hayloft as the fox hunted rats, with the efficiency of a predator who had refined technique over dozens of kills. She watched the fox consume her catch, watched her rest briefly, watched her prepare to leave. And then, with the confidence of a child who had never learned to fear consequences, Megan climbed down from the loft and approached the fox. "Hello, fox," she whispered, extending her hand the way she had seen people do with dogs in the city parks. The fox's response was immediate and instinctive. She bared her teeth, her body dropping into a defensive crouch. She was cornered between the child and the barn wall, her escape route blocked, her options reduced to fight or submit. Megan froze, her child mind finally processing that this was not a dog, not a pet, not something safe to approach. This was a wild animal, cornered and afraid, and wild animals were dangerous when afraid. The fox could have bitten, should have bitten, by every defensive instinct foxes possessed. A bite to the hand, to the face, anything to create opening for escape. Children who cornered wild animals learned painful lessons, and foxes who taught those lessons sometimes survived the education. But the vixen hesitated. Perhaps it was the child's size, smaller than the fox expected humans to be. Perhaps it was exhaustion overriding aggression. Perhaps it was something else entirely, some recognition that violence here would end the truce with the farmer, would close the barn, would eliminate the hunting ground that was keeping 8 kits alive. She did not bite. Instead, she vocalized, a sharp bark of warning, of fear, of desperate communication that said, "Move, let me pass. I do not want to hurt you, but I will if you force me." Megan stumbled backward, finally understanding her danger. She pressed against the hay bales, making herself small, and the fox darted past her, a red blur moving toward the gap in the barn door. But in her panic, the fox knocked over a metal bucket. The clang echoed through the barn like a gunshot, and suddenly Thomas was running from the house, and Megan was crying, and the fox was gone into the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas found his granddaughter shaken but unharmed. The story came out in gasps. The fox in the barn, Megan following, the confrontation, the escape. Thomas's face cycled through relief and anger and something else, something complicated. "Did it bite you?" he asked, checking her hands, her arms, anywhere teeth might have found purchase. "No," Megan whispered. "It could have. It was right there, but it just ran away." Thomas pulled her into a hug, his mind processing this information. The fox could have bitten his granddaughter. By rights, by instinct, by the logic of cornered predators, it should have. But it had chosen escape over aggression, had vocalized a warning, and fled when given the opportunity. "You're not to go near it again," he said firmly. "Do you understand me? It's wild. It's not safe." Megan nodded against his shoulder, and Thomas carried her back to the farmhouse, his mind troubled by the pattern that was emerging. A fox who released roosters, who hunted rats instead of chickens, who warned children instead of biting them. What was he dealing with? What kind of animal made these choices? Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The barn door remained open, but the fox did not return for 3 days. Thomas found himself watching for her, feeling an absence he could not quite explain. The rats grew bolder without predation pressure. A hen disappeared one night to what was probably a stoat or weasel, smaller predators the fox's presence might have deterred. On the fourth day, near dusk, Thomas walked to the barn and found fresh fox tracks in the dust near the door. She had returned, had assessed, had decided the risk was manageable. He felt an unexpected relief, followed immediately by irritation at himself for caring whether a wild fox chose his barn for hunting. He positioned himself at the house window with his binoculars as evening settled. Megan was inside watching television, safely contained. The sheep were penned for the night. The chickens were secure in their reinforced coop. He had finally repaired the gap the fox had used. As darkness deepened, the fox appeared. She approached the barn with extreme caution, her body language readable even at a distance, wariness balanced against necessity. She paused at the entrance, reading scent and sound, assessing threat level. Then she entered, and Thomas watched her hunt, watched her catch and consume a rat, watched her rest for perhaps 10 minutes before departing. The routine was re-establishing itself, the unspoken truce reforming. But Thomas's curiosity had been triggered. Where did she go when she left his barn? Why was she so desperately in need of food that she was willing to risk proximity to humans? Normal foxes avoided human contact except in extreme circumstances. This vixen was choosing it repeatedly. The next evening, Thomas followed her. It was foolish. He was 63 years old, not built for cross-country tracking in darkness. But curiosity overrode prudence, and he wanted to understand this animal who kept making choices that defied his understanding of fox behavior. He tracked her south, staying distant, using the skills learned from decades of moving through his own land in all conditions. The vixen led him perhaps half a mile, before reaching a rock outcropping he knew well. She disappeared into a crevice at its base, and from within came sounds that explained everything. The high-pitched mewling of fox kits. She had a litter. Of course she had a litter. It was late May, prime season for fox kits, and a nursing mother would need extra calories. That's why she was hunting so desperately, why she was willing to risk human proximity. She was feeding not just herself but offspring. Thomas waited, watching. The vixen emerged from the den after perhaps 15 minutes, and then, instead of settling down to rest or patrol, she began traveling north. He followed at a greater distance, confused by the direction. She was moving away from her den, away from safety, heading back toward his farm. She was heading back toward his farm. But why? She had already hunted in his barn that evening, had fed, had returned to nurse her kits. There was no reason for a second trip, unless... The vixen passed his farm completely, continued north, and Thomas, now thoroughly invested despite his protesting knees, followed. Another mile, maybe more, into territory he knew less well. And then the vixen stopped at a fallen log and crawled inside. From within came the same sound, kit mewling, but different kits, different voices. Thomas stood in the darkness, his mind assembling pieces of a puzzle he had not known existed. This vixen was maintaining 2 dens, nursing 2 litters, traveling between them, hunting in his barn to sustain the caloric demands of what had to be 8 or more kits. But foxes didn't adopt. They were solitary animals who struggled to raise their own litters. The idea of a vixen taking on orphans, splitting resources, running herself to exhaustion to save kits who were not genetically hers, it violated everything he understood about wildlife behavior. Yet here was the evidence. A vixen emerging from a second den, traveling south toward her primary litter, moving with the exhausted determination of an animal operating beyond its limits. Thomas walked back to his farm slowly, his mind revolving around what he had witnessed. When he reached home near midnight, Megan was asleep, and his wife Mary was reading in the kitchen, waiting up with the patience of someone who had lived with a farmer's unpredictable schedule for 40 years. "You'll not believe what I've discovered," he said, and told her about the 2 dens, the 2 litters, the vixen running herself to death trying to save them all. Mary listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to wonder. "That's not possible," she said. "Animals don't do that. They can't afford to." "I know," Thomas replied, "but she is." They sat in silence, contemplating the implications. Finally, Mary spoke. "What will you do?" It was the question Thomas had been asking himself through the entire walk home. The vixen was using his barn, his property, to sustain an act of impossible compassion. She was depleting herself to save orphans. She was making choices that looked, from a certain angle, almost noble. What was his responsibility in the face of such behavior? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll not close the barn to her. That much I know." Over the following weeks, Thomas became an inadvertent accomplice to the vixen's mission. He did not feed her directly, that line remained uncrossed. But he left the barn accessible. He stopped hunting rats as aggressively. He created conditions where her foraging might be more successful. He also watched, becoming expert in fox behavior, learning to read the vixen's body language, her energy levels, her hunting patterns. He saw her growing thinner despite successful hunts, saw the exhaustion in her movements, saw an animal pushing itself toward collapse in service of 8 lives that demanded more than she could sustainably give. Megan, confined to supervised farm activities after her barn incident, became fascinated with the fox story. She drew pictures of foxes and kits, asked endless questions about animal behavior, begged to see the dens. Thomas refused the den visits. That was too close, too disruptive. But he told her what he observed, edited for a child's understanding. He explained about the mother fox who had died, about the vixen who was trying to save the orphans, about the delicate balance of wild lives that humans could witness but should not interfere with. "But we're already interfering," Megan pointed out with a child's clarity, "by letting her hunt in the barn." She was right, of course. Thomas had already crossed the line from observer to participant. The question was not whether to interfere, but how much and to what end. In late June, crisis came. Thomas arrived at his barn one morning to find the vixen inside, but not hunting. She was lying on her side, her breathing labored, her body showing the kind of exhaustion that precedes collapse. She saw him enter and tried to rise, but her legs would not support her weight. She had finally, inevitably, pushed herself beyond recovery. Her body, depleted of fat reserves, running on nothing but will and desperation, had stopped functioning. Thomas approached slowly, speaking in low tones. "Easy now, easy." The vixen's eyes tracked him, but she did not have the energy to flee. She simply lay there, her body communicating surrender not to him, but to the limits of endurance. Thomas knew he faced a choice. He could let nature take its course, leave the vixen to die, allow the 8 kits to starve, permit natural selection to make its cold calculation about who deserved to survive. It was what most wildlife experts would recommend. Do not interfere. Let wild things remain wild. Or he could intervene, could try to save this animal who had shown mercy to his roosters, had warned rather than bitten his granddaughter, had attempted to save orphans at the cost of her own survival. He made his choice in the same heartbeat he had made all his choices about the fox, instinctively from something deeper than logic. He called the local wildlife rehabilitation center. Part 3. The Revelation and the Fracture. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived within 90 minutes, her small car bouncing up Thomas's farm road with the equipment that marked her as someone who made a profession of impossible rescues. She was 40, compact and efficient, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen every permutation of wildlife crisis and learned to triage with ruthless practicality. Thomas met her at the barn door. She's inside, collapsed, exhausted. I think she's been nursing 2 litters. Sarah's eyebrows rose. 2 litters? That's unusual. You're certain? I've tracked her to 2 separate dens. One's her own, half a mile south, the other's about a mile north. Orphans, I'd guess, from a vixen I shot 2 weeks back for raiding my henhouse. Sarah processed this information as she gathered her equipment: net, carrier, sedative if needed. If what you're describing is accurate, she's attempting something I've never documented. Foxes don't typically adopt. The caloric demands are too high. Well, this one's trying, Thomas said, and it's killing her. They entered the barn together. The vixen was where Thomas had left her, conscious but unmoving, her amber eyes tracking their approach with the wariness of prey who had run out of options. Sarah knelt 10 feet from the fox, reading her condition from a distance. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, probable anemia from parasites, common in nursing vixens. She's maybe 2 weeks from death if she continues this way. Can you save her? Sarah was quiet for a moment, making calculations. I can stabilize her. Fluids, nutrients, antiparasitics. But here's the problem. If I take her in for treatment, her kits starve. All 8 of them. If I leave her, she dies anyway, and the kits stop producing milk. Either way, we're looking at mortality. Thomas felt the weight of the choice. He had intervened by tracking the fox, by calling the rehabilitation center. But intervention had only made visible the cruel mathematics of the situation. What if, he began, then stopped, uncertain how to articulate what he was thinking. What if what? Sarah prompted. What if you stabilize her here, IV fluids or whatever you can do, and then I supplement the kits, bottle feeding, until she recovers enough to resume nursing? Sarah stared at him. You're talking about bottle feeding wild fox kits? 8 of them, at 2 different den sites, multiple times per day, for potentially weeks. Is it possible? Possible, yes. Advisable? She shook her head. You'd be habituating them to human contact, reducing their wild viability, potentially creating animals who can't survive release. And even if you do everything right, the survival rate for hand-raised fox kits is maybe 50%. Better than 0%, Thomas countered. Sarah studied him, reading the determination in his weathered face. Why do you care? She's just a fox. There are hundreds of foxes in Wales, thousands. One vixen dying is statistically meaningless. Thomas looked at the fox, at the animal who had held his rooster and released it, who had warned his granddaughter instead of biting, who was dying in his barn because she had tried to save orphans. Maybe it's not about statistics, he said quietly. Maybe some things matter because they matter, not because they make sense. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed, the sound of someone who knew she was about to make a professionally questionable decision for personally compelling reasons. All right, let's stabilize her. But you need to understand what you're committing to. Fox kits nurse every 2 to 3 hours. You'll be sleep-deprived, exhausted, and there's no guarantee any of them survive. Are you truly prepared for that? I'm a farmer, Thomas said simply. Sleep-deprived and exhausted is my baseline. And I've hand-raised lambs before. Can't be that different. Sarah's laugh was short and sharp. All right, let's sedate her and get an IV started. The process was quick and professional. Sarah administered a mild sedative that allowed her to handle the vixen without traumatic stress. She established an IV line, pushed fluids and nutrients, administered antiparasitics. Within 30 minutes, the vixen was stabilized. Still weak, still malnourished, but no longer on the edge of death. She needs 48 hours of rest minimum, Sarah said, checking the IV flow rate. No hunting, no traveling between dens, just sleep and nutrition. Which means the kits need feeding now, Thomas said. Sarah nodded. I'll show you how. But first, we need to secure her somewhere safe. She looked around the barn. You have a shed or outbuilding we can convert into a temporary recovery space? Thomas thought of his old sheep shed, unused since he downsized his flock. I've got something. Small, secure, quiet. Will that work? It'll do. They moved the sedated vixen to the sheep shed, creating a recovery space with straw bedding, water access, and the IV still attached. Sarah set up a feeding station, high-quality dog food supplemented with vitamins, positioned where the vixen could access it when she woke. Then came the harder part, locating and accessing both dens. Thomas led Sarah to the closer den first, the vixen's original litter beneath the rock outcropping. 5 kits emerged at the den entrance when they smelled food, their eyes bright with hunger, their small bodies showing the robust health of well-nourished pups. Sarah examined them with practiced efficiency. These are good. Healthy weight, clear eyes, good coat condition. They're maybe 4 weeks old, starting to eat solid food but still nursing. If we supplement with formula for a few days, they'll be fine. The orphan den was more concerning. 3 kits, noticeably smaller and weaker than their adopted siblings. Their coats were duller, their movements less energetic. They showed signs of stress, the physical manifestation of insufficient nutrition. These are struggling, Sarah said quietly. Born to a young or malnourished mother, probably. And even with the vixen's best efforts, they're not getting enough. We'll need to supplement them more heavily. She showed Thomas the feeding protocol. Special Fox formula mixed to specific ratios, warmed to body temperature, delivered via bottles designed for small mammals. Feed every 3 hours around the clock. Monitor weight daily. Watch for signs of digestive distress or rejection. And you need to minimize human contact, Sarah emphasized. Wear gloves. Don't talk to them. Don't pet them. They need to remain wild enough to release when the vixen recovers. Thomas listened, absorbing information, understanding that he was taking on a commitment that would dominate his life for weeks. But when he looked at the kits, particularly the 3 smaller orphans who mewed with the desperate hunger of animals who had been slowly starving, he knew there was no other choice. "I'll manage," he said. Sarah's expression suggested doubt, but she nodded. "I'll check back tomorrow. Monitor the vixen's recovery, assess the kits, adjust protocol as needed. Call me if anything changes. Deterioration, rejection of formula, signs of distress." She left Thomas with supplies, instructions, and a warning. What you're attempting is borderline impossible. Don't be surprised if you lose some of them. Don't be surprised if the vixen rejects the kits after human contact. Just do your best and accept that best might not be enough. After she left, Thomas sat in his kitchen with Mary and Megan, explaining what he had committed to. Mary's expression cycled through concern, resignation, and something that might have been admiration. "You're mad," she said finally, "completely mad." "Probably," Thomas admitted. "Can I help?" Megan asked, her eyes bright with the possibility of being part of this impossible mission. Thomas looked at his granddaughter, 8 years old, visiting from the city, desperate for connection to the natural world she had been insulated from. "You can," he said carefully, "but you need to follow the rules exactly. No petting, no talking to them, minimal contact." We're trying to save them, not domesticate them. Understand? Megan nodded with a seriousness that reminded Thomas of her mother at that age, his daughter who had grown up on this farm before moving to Cardiff, who had learned early that the land demanded both compassion and practicality. The first feeding was chaos. 8 kits across 2 dens, all hungry, all unfamiliar with bottles. Some took to the formula immediately. Others fought, rejecting the artificial nipple, crying for their mother. Thomas and Megan worked for 90 minutes to get all 8 fed, and by the end they were exhausted, frustrated, and unsure if they had done more harm than good. The 3-hour cycle began. Feed at dawn, feed at mid-morning, feed at afternoon, feed at dusk, feed at night, feed through the small hours when exhaustion made everything harder. and between feedings, monitor the vixen's recovery, maintain the farm, live some semblance of normal life. By the second day, Thomas understood that Sarah's warning had been inadequate. This was not merely difficult, it was consuming. Every aspect of his life revolved around feeding schedules, kit health checks, vixen monitoring. He was operating on perhaps 4 hours of sleep per night, in fragmented intervals that left him perpetually foggy. But the kits were surviving. More than surviving, they were beginning to thrive. The robust 5 from the primary den took enthusiastically to supplemental feeding, their weight increasing daily. The 3 orphans were slower to respond, but even they showed improvement, their energy increasing as proper nutrition reached their depleted systems. The vixen, sedated and resting in the sheep shed, recovered with the resilience of wild things given proper support. By the 3rd day, she was alert and eating. By the 5th day, she was attempting to stand. By the 7th day, Sarah removed the IV and declared her stable enough to return to active mothering. But there was a problem. The vixen, recovering in isolation, had been separated from her kits for a week. Would she still accept them? Would the scent of human contact trigger rejection? Fox mothers were known to abandon litters contaminated by human scent, an evolutionary response to perceived threat. We'll reintroduce her to the primary den first, Sarah decided. See if she accepts those kits. If she does, we'll try the orphans. They transported the vixen, still weak but mobile, back to the rock outcropping. Thomas released her near the den entrance and retreated, watching from 50 yards with binoculars. The vixen approached the den cautiously, reading scent, processing information. Her 5 kits emerged, mewing their recognition, their small bodies communicating joy in the way fox kits did, tail wagging, yipping, climbing over each other to reach her. The vixen sniffed each kit thoroughly, reading them, assessing. Thomas held his breath, waiting for rejection, for the mother to turn away from kits who smelled of human and formula and intervention. But she did not reject them. After a minute of thorough sniffing, she entered the den, and the kits followed, and through the binoculars, Thomas could see her settling down to nurse, her body language communicating acceptance. "First hurdle cleared," Sarah said from beside him. "Now for the hard one." The orphan den was 2 miles away, and the vixen was not strong enough to travel that distance yet. They would need to transport the orphans to her, a violation of protocol that could trigger rejection based on scent contamination alone. Sarah and Thomas collected the 3 orphans in a padded carrier, their small bodies protesting the handling with sharp yips of distress. They transported them to the primary den and released them near the entrance. The vixen emerged immediately, her body rigid, reading the situation. These were not her kits. They smelled wrong, of different den, different milk, different history. Not mine, not my responsibility. The orphans mewed, approaching her with the desperate hunger of kits who associated any adult fox with food and safety. They tried to nurse, pushing their way toward her with the aggressive determination of the starving. The vixen growled. It was a warning, a rejection, a clear statement. You do not belong. Thomas felt his heart sink. They had saved the vixen, had saved all 8 tits, and now it was falling apart because biology was reasserting its boundaries. But one of the orphans, the smallest female, the one who had been closest to death, did something unexpected. Instead of pushing to nurse, instead of demanding food, she simply curled against the vixen's side. She did not whine or demand. She simply settled there, her small body communicating not hunger, but the need for presence, for warmth, for mother in the existential sense. The vixen's growl faded. She looked down at this kid who was not demanding, but simply existing, and something in her posture shifted. Perhaps it was the memory of why she had been trying to save these kits in the first place. Perhaps it was exhaustion overriding rejection. Perhaps it was something deeper. The recognition that she had already committed to these lives, and walking away now would make everything she had suffered meaningless. She lay down. The smallest orphan remained curled against her. And after a moment, the other 2 orphans approached, tentative but hopeful, and the vixen did not reject them. She let all 8 kits nurse, her 5 robust offspring and the 3 orphans she had tried to save at the cost of her own life. She let them feed, and in that acceptance was the completion of something that had begun weeks earlier when she had held a rooster in her jaws and chosen mercy. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. July brought summer in full bloom to the Welsh hillside. The grass grew tall and rich, the wildflowers painted the meadows in purple and yellow, and the days stretched long enough that darkness felt temporary, a brief intermission between extended acts of light. The 8 kits thrived under their mother's resumed care, supplemented by Thomas's continued intervention. Sarah had advised weaning off the supplemental feeding gradually, allowing the vixen to resume full responsibility. But Thomas, now deeply invested in the survival of all 8, continued providing support. Leaving food near the den site, ensuring the vixen had access to the barn for hunting, creating conditions where a mother with 8 mouths to feed might actually succeed. The kits' personalities emerged as they grew. The 5 from the original litter were bold and robust, showing the confidence of animals who had never known scarcity. They were the first to explore beyond the den, the first to attempt hunting grasshoppers and beetles, the first to challenge their mother with play attacks that taught coordination and strength. The 3 orphans were more cautious, their early weeks of marginal nutrition leaving psychological imprints alongside the physical. They were smaller, slower to develop, more prone to startle at unexpected sounds. But they were alive and growing, and gradually their gap with their adopted siblings was narrowing. Megan had returned to Cardiff, her summer visit ending with tearful goodbyes to the fox family she had helped save. But she made Thomas promise to send updates, to tell her how the kits progressed, to let her know when they were ready to leave the den permanently. Thomas kept his promise, sending weekly photos and descriptions. The kits at 5 weeks, beginning to eat solid food. At 6 weeks, playing outside the den under mother's watchful eye. At 7 weeks, attempting their first clumsy hunts. At 8 weeks, growing into their oversized ears and paws, beginning to look like small adults rather than oversized puppies. The vixen, restored to health, proved to be an exceptional mother. She hunted with renewed vigor, her strength returned, her body rebuilding the reserves she had depleted. She taught her kits, all 8 of them, making no distinction between biological offspring and adopted orphans, the complex skills they would need to survive. How to stalk mice through tall grass, how to read wind direction for scent tracking, how to cache food for later consumption, how to avoid the dangers that could kill young foxes, vehicles, larger predators, humans with guns. Thomas watched this education from respectful distances, amazed by the vixen's patient instruction. She would demonstrate hunting techniques, allowing the kits to observe before attempting themselves. She would correct mistakes with gentle discipline, a soft growl here, a blocking movement there. She would share kills with perfect equity, ensuring all 8 kits received portions appropriate to their size. But July also brought challenges. Other predators noticed the concentration of young foxes. 8 kits in one location represented opportunity for those willing to fight a protective mother. Badgers, who competed with foxes for den sites and food, began appearing near the outcropping. A buzzard that hunted the area started eyeing the kits with the calculating gaze of a raptor assessing prey. And then there were the dogs. 2 farm dogs from a neighboring property, mixed breeds who ran loose despite local regulations, discovered the fox den during one of their ranging expeditions. Dogs and foxes were ancient enemies, competitors shaped by evolution to hate each other, and these dogs saw the kits as prey worth pursuing. Thomas was in his north pasture when he heard it, the vixen's alarm bark, sharp and desperate, carrying the specific pitch that meant danger, threat to young. He grabbed the walking stick he always carried and ran toward the sound, his 63-year-old legs protesting the sudden sprint. He reached the den site to find the vixen standing between her kits and two dogs that outweighed her by 30 pounds each. The kits had retreated into the den, but one of the smaller orphans, the male, always the slowest to respond to threats, was still outside, frozen in fear. The dogs were focused on the exposed kit, their predatory instincts engaged, their body language communicating imminent attack. The vixen barked again, trying to draw their attention, trying to interpose herself between dogs and kit. One dog lunged at the kit. The vixen intercepted, her small body colliding with the much larger dog, her jaws finding purchase on its ear. The dog yelped and turned on her, and suddenly they were fighting, fox and dog, maternal fury against predatory aggression. The second dog went for the kit. Thomas was still 20 yards away, too far to intervene. He shouted, hoping to distract, but the dog ignored him, focused entirely on the vulnerable fox kit. Then, from the den entrance, the 5 robust kits emerged. They were 9 weeks old, large enough to be mobile, bold enough to defend family. They attacked the second dog as a coordinated unit, 5 young foxes against 1 dog, their small jaws finding legs and tail and exposed belly. The dog was confused, overwhelmed by multiple attackers. It turned to snap at one kit and another bit its haunch. It turned again and a third kit attached to its ear. It was not serious injury, the kits were too young, their jaws too weak, but it was harassment, distraction, a multi-front assault that kept the dog from focusing on the vulnerable orphan. Thomas reached the fight and used his walking stick to drive the dogs back, his shouts now adding to the chaos. The vixen released the first dog's ear and retreated to her kits, calling them with sharp barks that meant disengage. Retreat. The kits obeyed, running to their mother, forming a defensive cluster. The dogs, bleeding from multiple small bites, faced a choice: press the attack against a united fox family and an angry human, or retreat. They chose retreat, running back toward their home territory with the wounded dignity of predators who had lost in engagement. Thomas stood among the foxes, breathing hard, his heart pounding. The vixen gathered her kits, checking each one, reading them for injury. All 8 were present, all unharmed. The male orphan who had been the initial target was shaken but intact, pressed against his mother's side. The vixen looked at Thomas. It was a brief glance, perhaps a second long, but in that moment passed communication that transcended species. Gratitude, recognition, the acknowledgement that he had intervened on her behalf. Then she herded her kits into the den, and Thomas was left alone on the hillside, processing what he had just witnessed. The kits had defended each other. The biological offspring had risked themselves to save the adopted orphan. The family that had been artificially created through human intervention had become real through shared danger and mutual protection. That evening, Thomas called the neighbor who owned the dogs. The conversation was tense but productive. The neighbor agreed to keep the dogs confined to prevent future incidents. Thomas did not mention that the wild animal his dogs had attacked was a fox family he had been actively protecting. Some details were better left unshared. Sarah visited 2 days later for a progress check. She examined the kits, measured weights, assessed development. Her verdict was cautiously optimistic. "They're doing better than I expected," she admitted. "All 8 showing good weight gain, appropriate development for their age. The orphans are still smaller, but they're catching up. If this continues, they'll all be viable for release." "Release?" Thomas asked, though he had known this moment was coming. "They're wild foxes, Thomas. At some point, probably around 12 weeks, they need to disperse, to find their own territories. The vixen will push them out naturally, and we should support that process rather than interfering. Thomas knew she was right, but he had spent 2 months invested in these lives, had lost sleep and energy and emotional reserves ensuring their survival. The thought of them leaving, of returning to the wild where he could not protect them, triggered an unexpected sense of loss. "When?" he asked. "Probably another month, maybe less. You'll know when the vixen starts distancing herself, when she stops bringing food, when she actively discourages them from following. That's when we step back completely." The following weeks passed with the bittersweet quality of anticipated endings. The kits grew larger, more independent, more capable. They began ranging farther from the den, exploring territory that would eventually become their own ranges. The vixen still provided guidance, but her involvement was decreasing, her patience with demanding offspring wearing thin. By mid-August, the shift was complete. The vixen stopped bringing food to the den. She began spending nights away, returning only briefly. When the kits attempted to follow, she actively discouraged them with growls and snaps. It was time for dispersal. The kits were 11 weeks old, large enough and skilled enough to survive on their own. Nature's script called for them to leave, to find territories unclaimed by other foxes, to begin the adult phase of their lives. The 5 biological offspring dispersed first. Over a period of 4 days, they left individually, heading in different directions, following the instinct that prevented siblings from competing for the same resources. Thomas watched them go with mixed emotions, pride in their survival, sadness at their departure. The 3 orphans were slower to leave. Perhaps their marginal start had delayed maturation. Perhaps the trauma of early loss made them cling harder to security. But finally, they too began to disperse. The smallest female, the one who had curled against the vixen in that critical moment of potential rejection, was the last to leave. She remained near the den for 3 days after her siblings departed, as if waiting for permission to go. Finally, the vixen made the decision for her. She drove her away with aggressive charges, with clear communication that there was no place for her here anymore. The kit retreated, confused and hurt, but finally accepting that childhood was over. She traveled north toward the Moss farm, and he watched her approach with binoculars, wondering if she would remember this place, if some instinct would guide her toward the barn where her adopted mother had hunted. She paused at the farm's edge, reading scent, processing information. Then she moved on, continuing north, following whatever internal compass guided dispersing foxes toward unclaimed territory. Thomas watched until she disappeared over the hill, and then she was gone, and the chapter was closed. Part 5. The Resolution and Renewal. Autumn arrived with the gentle decay that marked seasonal transitions. The wildflowers faded to seed heads. The grass yellowed and dried. The days shortened noticeably, each sunset coming earlier, each dawn arriving later. The vixen remained in her territory, solitary again, her den empty of the noise and chaos of 8 kits. Thomas occasionally saw her hunting in his barn, their unspoken truce continuing into the fall. She was sleek and healthy, her body restored to pre-pregnancy condition, her movements showing the ease of an animal no longer operating on the edge of exhaustion. He wondered about the kits, where they had dispersed to, whether they had found territories, whether they would survive the coming winter. Fox mortality in the first year was high. Perhaps half of all kits died before reaching maturity. Some would fall to predators, some to vehicles, some to starvation when hunting skills proved inadequate. But some would survive, and those survivors would carry forward the lessons learned from a mother who had chosen to save orphans, who had demonstrated that family could extend beyond genetic similarity, who had shown that courage sometimes meant protecting lives that were not your responsibility. In late September, Thomas received a call from a neighboring farmer 2 miles north. "I've got a fox in my barn," the farmer said. "Young one, not causing problems, just hunting mice. Thought you might want to know, since you've got that soft spot for foxes now." Thomas drove over, curious. The farmer led him to the barn, where a young vixen, small, with a distinctive white patch on her shoulder from an old wound, was efficiently hunting rodents. It was the smallest orphan, the one who had been closest to death, who had curled against her adopted mother in that critical moment. She had dispersed north, had found unclaimed territory, and had discovered that barns provided good hunting, just as she had learned from watching her mother. Thomas watched her for perhaps 10 minutes. She knew he was there. Her ears tracked him, her body remained alert. But she did not flee. Perhaps she recognized his scent. Perhaps she simply assessed him as non-threatening. Or perhaps she had learned from her mother that humans were not always danger, that sometimes they were simply part of the landscape. "You want me to drive her off?" the neighbor asked. "No," Thomas said quietly. "Let her hunt. She's keeping your rat population down. That's worth more than a few chickens ever would be." The neighbor looked at him with surprise, but nodded. "Your call. If she starts taking livestock, though." "She won't," Thomas said, with more certainty than he probably deserved, but he believed it. This fox had been taught a different way, had learned that some boundaries were worth respecting, that coexistence was possible when both species chose it. October brought the first hard frost. The landscape transformed, color leaching away, leaving the skeletal beauty of approaching winter. Thomas prepared his farm for cold months, reinforcing structures, stockpiling feed, ensuring his animals would survive whatever weather came. He reinforced the chicken coop, but left the barn door positioned exactly as it had been, open enough for fox entry, a continuing invitation to hunt rodents rather than poultry. On a cold evening in late October, he sat by his fireplace with Mary, watching the flames, reflecting on the strange summer they had experienced. "Do you think it was worth it?" Mary asked. "All that time, all that effort for foxes?" Thomas considered. He had lost sleep, had exhausted himself, had committed resources to saving wild animals that owed him nothing and would never thank him in any way he could understand. "I think," he said slowly, "that we live in a world that's very good at calculating worth in monetary terms, in cost-benefit analyses, and by those measures, no, it probably wasn't worth it. 8 foxes saved, some of whom will die before maturity anyway. No economic return, no tangible benefit." He paused, watching the fire. "But that vixen held my rooster in her jaws and released it. She chose not to bite Megan when cornered. She tried to save orphans at the cost of her own life. And those choices suggested something beyond simple predator-prey dynamics, something that looked almost like compassion, I suppose, or at least the capacity for choice beyond instinct." "And that's worth saving?" Mary asked gently. "I think anything that demonstrates the capacity for choice beyond pure survival, whether in fox or human, is worth protecting." Because that's where hope lives, in those moments when we choose mercy over necessity, when we protect what we're not required to protect, when we save what makes no logical sense to save. Mary reached over and took his hand. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had spent 40 years building a life on this land, who understood that farming was always a balance between pragmatism and compassion, between the hard math of survival and the soft calculus of caring. Winter came. The snow fell, the temperature dropped, and in barns across the valley, young foxes hunted. Their survival made possible by a vixen who had taught them that humans were not always enemies, that some boundaries could be respected, that coexistence was possible. Not all the kits survived the winter. Thomas heard reports of foxes found dead on roads, of young animals who had not learned caution quickly enough. Each report made him wonder if it was one of his kits, one of the lives he had invested in. But he also heard reports of foxes successfully establishing territories, of young vixens and dog foxes seen hunting, thriving, surviving. and he allowed himself to believe that at least some of those survivors were kits he had bottle-fed, animals who had been given a chance they would not otherwise have had. The original vixen, the mother who had adopted orphans, remained in her territory through the winter. Thomas saw her occasionally, always at a distance, always wild and independent. She had returned to the life foxes were meant to live, solitary, cautious, surviving on skill and instinct. But sometimes, when Thomas was in his barn at dawn or dusk, she would appear at the door. She would not enter while he was present, but she would pause, would make eye contact, would acknowledge his presence before moving on. In those moments, Thomas felt he understood something about the relationship between humans and wildlife. It was not about domestication or taming. It was not about making wild things dependent on human care. It was about respect, the recognition that we share this world with other intelligent beings, that their lives have value beyond their utility to us, that sometimes the most profound gift we can offer is simply the space to exist. Spring returned, as it always did. The snow melted, the grass greened, the cycle continued. The vixen had a new litter, 5 kits this time, all her own, all thriving in the security of established territory. Thomas did not intervene, did not bottle feed, did not supplement, did not insert himself into her parenting. She had proven she could manage, and his role was finished. But he left the barn door open, left the territory undisturbed, created conditions where a fox family could thrive without the constant pressure of human interference. Megan visited again in summer, now 9 years old, taller and more confident. She asked about the foxes immediately, wanting to see the new kits, to check on the ones she had helped save. Thomas showed her the den site from a respectful distance. The vixen emerged briefly, 5 new kits tumbling after her, and Megan's face lit with joy. "Are any of last year's kits still around?" she asked. "Some," Thomas said. "There's a young vixen hunting in David's barn, 2 miles north. I'm fairly sure she's the smallest orphan. And I've seen tracks suggesting at least 2 others established territories within 5 miles. So we saved them," Megan said with satisfaction. "We gave them a chance," Thomas corrected gently. "They saved themselves by learning, adapting, surviving. We just provided space for that to happen." As they walked back to the farmhouse, Megan was quiet, processing. Finally, she asked, "Grandpa, why do you think the mama fox let the rooster go, the one who started everything?" Thomas had thought about this question for a year, had contemplated it through hundreds of hours of watching fox behavior, of reading animal psychology, of trying to understand the choices the vixen had made. "I don't know for certain," he admitted. "Maybe she was exhausted, couldn't afford a confrontation with roosters that might fight back. Maybe she calculated that the risk wasn't worth the reward. Or," he paused, choosing words carefully, "maybe she recognized something, that killing my rooster would bring human retaliation, would close off the hunting territory she needed. Maybe she was smart enough to make a strategic choice rather than instinctive one. Or maybe," Megan said thoughtfully, "she just didn't want to kill that day. Maybe sometimes animals choose mercy for the same reasons people do, because it feels right, even when it's not logical." Thomas looked at his granddaughter with surprise and respect. "Maybe so," he agreed. "Maybe so." That evening, as dusk settled over the farm, Thomas walked to the barn. The vixen was there, hunting with the focused efficiency of an experienced predator. She had caught 2 rats and was working on a 3rd. She saw him enter, paused in her hunting, met his eyes across the barn floor. In that gaze was a year of history, mercy and intervention, survival and loss, the complex dance of 2 species learning to coexist in shared space. Then she returned to her hunting, and Thomas turned to leave, and the moment passed, as all moments do, absorbed into the continuous flow of days and seasons and lives lived at the intersection of wild and domestic. As he walked back to his house under emerging stars, Thomas thought about the question Mary had asked. Was it worth it? He had no definitive answer, no metric that could measure the value of 8 fox lives against the time and energy invested in saving them. But he thought about a vixen who had tried to save orphans at the cost of her own life. He thought about kits who had defended each other against dogs, who had survived against odds, who were now scattered across the valley, establishing territories and living the lives foxes were meant to live. He thought about his granddaughter, who had learned that wildlife was not something to fear or control, but to respect and protect, that sometimes the most important interventions were the gentle ones, that coexistence was possible when both species made space for each other. And he thought about himself, a farmer who had spent 43 years balancing pragmatism and compassion, who had learned late in life that the boundaries between wild and domestic, between predator and protector, were more fluid than he had imagined. Was it worth it? Perhaps the question itself was flawed. Perhaps worth was not something calculated, but something recognized in the moment, in amber eyes meeting his across a henhouse floor, in the sound of fox kits playing outside a den, in the knowledge that mercy offered had been mercy returned, that protection extended had created ripples extending far beyond a single summer. The world turned, seasons changed, lives were born and lived and ended, and in a small valley in Wales, foxes and humans had learned, imperfectly, tentatively, but genuinely, to share space, to recognize value in each other, to choose coexistence over conflict. It was not a perfect solution. Nature did not offer those. But it was something, a small demonstration that the boundaries we drew between species, between wild and domestic, between those we protected and those we hunted, were choices we made rather than immutable laws. And sometimes, when conditions aligned and individuals chose differently, those boundaries could shift, could soften, could reveal possibilities that statistics and logic said should not exist. The vixen would live perhaps 3 more years, raising perhaps 2 more litters, contributing her genetic legacy to the valley's fox population. Some of her offspring would carry forward the lessons she had learned, that humans were not always threats, that barns were good hunting, that strategic choices sometimes served better than pure instinct. And in barns across the valley, farmers would notice foxes hunting mice and rats, and some would drive them away with guns and dogs, but others would remember the story of Thomas Pritchard and the vixen who had tried to save orphans, and they would leave barn doors positioned just so, would create space for coexistence, would choose tolerance over elimination. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of ecological systems and wildlife management, but small things accumulated, created patterns, established precedents. And perhaps, in time, those small choices would add up to something larger, a landscape where humans and wildlife found ways to coexist, where the boundaries between wild and domestic became meeting places rather than battlegrounds. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. The vixen hunted in the barn, focused and efficient. And Thomas Pritchard walked into his house, where Mary waited with tea and companionship, where warmth and light pushed back the darkness, where a life built on the land continued its quiet progression toward whatever endings and beginnings awaited. It was enough. It had to be enough, because in the end, that was all any of them, human or fox, predator or prey, wild or domestic, could hope for. To live, to choose, to sometimes extend mercy and sometimes receive it, and to leave behind something, kits or knowledge, stories or survival, that suggested their lives had mattered. The night deepened. The valley settled into darkness. And in the space between wild and tame, between calculation and compassion, life continued its ancient dance, writing stories that would never fully told, but that mattered nonetheless, simply because they happened, because choices had been made, because mercy had been offered and returned. And in that exchange, fragile, imperfect, but real, was everything that mattered.